afternoon. That was a wonderful speech by Ambassador Huckabee, wasn't it? And now we have a panel we have a wonderful panel of people to talk about the changing administrations. And wait a minute, is Norm coming, by the way? All right. Let me introduce some of our panelists. Sarah Stern, who's the founder and president of the Endowment for Middle East Truth, EMET, important pro-Israel organization. We have Michael Makovsky of Mike. Sorry. Yeah, it's confusing the mics. Michael Makovsky of JINSA, the Jewish Institute for National Security Affairs, and Eugene Kontorovich of the George Mason University Law School and the Kohelet Law Forum and Heritage. So let me start. I'll ask you, I'll start with you, Mike. That mic, not this mic. And we'll have the other panelists chime in as they like. There's no question that Trump 2.0 represents a major shift in U.S.-Israel relations, and for the better. What do you think are the most important ways that this was going to be felt as we go forward? I think it should be on.
Okay. First of all, I just want to say I apologize for my attire. My flight was late, missed the connection. The luggage hasn't arrived yet. So
we've all been there.
Okay, yeah, I'm sure. I was about to say, I'm sure it's never happened to any of you, but it's a little more embarrassing now. So how does Trump 2.0 differ?
How is this going to be felt, do you think?
Well,
aside from atmospherics,
right.
In terms of politics.
Look, obviously on certain things it's been night and day with Biden. Until the other day, you didn't have President Trump even talking about humanitarian concerns about Gaza, how many trucks were coming in into Gaza. That's been obviously extremely positive. The support, the discussion or non-discussion about or non-insistence on a Palestinian state now has been another obvious change, been a lot more support. I will say, and maybe there's some that we'll talk about, and obviously President Trump, and certainly based on his first term, is, extremely pro-Israel. And the base of the Republican Party right now is much more pro-Israel, obviously, than the base of the Democratic Party. However, I do have some concerns whether we are going to see a big difference. And the biggest concern right now is on Iran.
Right.
And I don't know if you wanted me to discuss that right now or not.
Well, let me get to Iran in a minute.
But that's my biggest concern right now with the Trump administration, actually.
Yeah.
If I could say one thing?
Sure, go ahead.
One ad thing, and we all talk about politics, and I know we're going to talk about the administration, but I think we shouldn't forget the one thing you've seen a change, and I think it precedes a bit with Biden, but it really starts, I think, at the end of the Trump administration that doesn't get enough attention, and that is the U.S. military relationship with the IDF. And while I think that's gotten stronger over the last few years, I think a pivotal development was something actually that my organization, JINSA, alone pushed for, which was Israel being put in the area of responsibility of the U.S. Central Command, our Mideast Command. President Trump approved that in January of 2021, and I have to say that has been a game changer. And even the Israelis, when you talk to the IDF, and I started talking to them about this, I don't know, 7, 8 years ago, they didn't understand how important it was. But if you talk to any IDF general, even before October 7th, they would tell you it's been a game changer about how it's brought the two militaries working closer together. And we saw this last year, especially in April of a year ago when the Iranians fired missiles and drones to Israel. And the two militaries and the Arab countries worked together to protect their Israeli airspace. And I think Trump deserves a lot of credit for approving that. I think it's had a momentous change in the bilateral relationship. I just wanted to add that. Thank you.
I think that's a fair point. Sarah?
First of all, before I begin, I want to thank you, Jonathan Tobin, you've been an amazing, amazing editor and a phenomenal writer. I want to thank my dear friends Richard and Phyllis Heidemann for putting this all together. Josh Katson and his wife Amelia, I can't thank you enough for everything you do for JNS. And my wonderful husband out there, Buddy Stern.
Okay.
And I want to begin by saying the choices that we had last November were pretty stark. If Kamala Harris would have been elected, I am sure that by now we would have had the talks of a Palestinian state, if not Palestinian statehood. And the atmospherics, I think, are very, very important. I also have concerns about where we're going in the Iranian nuclear negotiations, which we'll get into. But considering what choices we had, I think that we are far better off with Donald Trump in the White House than we could have ever been with Kamala Harris as the president.
Well,
when things are bad, you feel them intensely. And then when they get good, you forget that it was ever bad and you forget what the bad felt like. So the Biden administration did one of the, I think, most hostile actions any U.S. administration has taken by sanctioning Israeli citizens, creating a sanctions program aimed solely at a democratic ally, the only one of its kind that threatened to essentially put Israel in the category of Libya and North Korea. It got very little attention. They even sanctioned, unconstitutionally, I would say, and I'm involved in representing these people, U.S. citizens who are not allowed to sanction under foreign sanctions laws. Many senators came to visit them and hear about their plight. No, actually none. President Trump lifted those sanctions on day one. Instead, he implemented sanctions on the International Criminal Court. Those sanctions, I believe, need to be extended and deepened, because if the ICC survives the Trump term, they're going to turn around and sanction people in the Trump administration, because the enemies of Israel are also the enemies of America. This is not a favor to Prime Minister Netanyahu. The indictments, the warrants against the Israeli government are a trial run at whether you can indict leaders of a democratic state and, colluding with the deep state apparatus of that state, bring down a democracy, and that will for sure be they prosecuted him in state court, they prosecuted him in federal court, for sure they're going to try international court. That is crucial. Just last week, the Justice Department reversed a position of the Biden administration. The Biden administration said if a country sponsors terror, and like Iran, you can sue them. But the Justice Department under Biden said if UNRWA sponsors terror, in fact becomes a terror organization, American victims cannot get justice from them in court. The Trump administration just reversed that position, and hopefully they'll codify that in law in a bill introduced by Senator Cruz, the Libel Act.
that's an excellent point. Let me turn to Iran, because I know we're all eager to talk about it. Now, the one thing, perhaps the one issue on which the Trump 2.0 administration is not speaking with one voice, because in the first administration there was lots of civil war in the Trump White House. Right now they're kind of all on the same page, with the exception of Iran, and now we have all the symptoms of such dissension, with like leaks to the New York Times and a debate. Where do each of you think this is going to come down? You can argue that Trump has earned some trust from the pro-Israel community and from Israel, but where is this heading? What does it mean? Mike, why don't you start?
Okay. By the way, I did want to acknowledge Josh Katson, who's my daughter Sophia's favorite board member of JINSA, and also one of my favorite board members. So, Josh, thank you. It's a good question. I hope to learn a little more while I'm in Israel in the next few days. It's very concerning, I'm sure, for all of us. I think the president's instincts are often very good. Look how he's handled the Houthis. I think that Houthi story deserves just a second for all those who read the transcript of the article about that Signalgate, that discussion. You had a whole administration. You had all these senior officials debating what to do until senior official Miller says, "Well, the president already gave a green light," and that was the end of it. Yeah. If I was the president of the United States and I said to do something, and then I got all my senior officials arguing about whether we should do it, personally, I'd be pretty furious about it.
That's an important point because unlike in the previous administration, which we were talking about contrast, there is only one person who really counts in this administration, isn't it? Isn't that the truth?
Yeah, and I think I give Trump's instincts on this with the Houthis, obviously after Biden did almost absolutely nothing. We're correct, and I give the president a lot of credit. That said, and I think it was a good warning shot for the Iranians. However, it does seem, as we see in that discussion and the New York Times article that you mentioned, there is a division within this administration between the so-called restrainers and maybe we would call them more traditional Republicans or Reaganite Republicans or whatever you want to call them, Rubio and Waltz and so on. Right now, and then you have Witkoff, who I think we could all argue, even if he had spent decades studying all these different issues, would be tested to deal with Russia and Iran and Gaza, and we all know that he hasn't spent decades studying any of these issues.
But he has had a lot of dealings with Qatar.
Yes, and he's had a lot of dealings with Qatar, and you're right, and he's been extremely effusive in his praise.
They've been extremely generous with him.
Yes, very much so. They've been very generous with him. And by the way, there's another issue. We talk about Turkey, but that's another concern I would say about this administration. But they're related to Qatar. I do think on the Iran thing, I've thought for months that Israel was going to attack this spring. And that New York Times article seemed to suggest that. I do think we don't know. It's possible that God will harden Pharaoh's heart here, make the Iranian demands just too much for this administration to bear. I think that Israel, I think the fundamentals, my own gut is, and I don't have inside information about this, but I think the fundamentals are the same, which is that Israel, it's going to be a tough one, conversation with the president, but they have no choice, I think, to act alone. I think people shouldn't forget the leverage that the administration has going into these talks has been created by Israel and Israeli blood, not by the United States. And while I give Trump credit for putting maximum pressure, that has absolutely almost no impact in the short term on the negotiation. Yes, the Iranians have to worry about the economy, but this is about what Israel did on the field since Rafah last year, and they've set the table. And I think given that and how existential this is, and the issue for Israel, I think, it's not about weaponization and how close Iran is to weaponization. The question is opportunity for Israel to strike, and that opportunity, I think, is now. And I think if Israel decides that things are getting out of hand in Oman or wherever the talks are going to be, I think they're going to have a conversation with Trump, and they're going to have to say we're going to have to act. And I think it's going to put the president, I think, in a tough position because it's possible that on this issue, unlike many other issues like tariffs and so on, you might have Republicans in Congress that might have to actually stand up and disagree with the president. And then you have other parts of the Republican base, like the evangelicals, that might also. So I think it's a complicated situation, but my feeling in short is I think Israel has no choice to act in its own national interest, and that might be right now, even that if that creates a little friction with President Trump.
I want to have one more question to get to, so I'll just briefly, from both you, Sarah, and you, Eugene, just give us a little bit more about this issue. And let me just quickly, Sarah, you're in Washington all the time. This isn't an pro-Israel, anti-Israel debate within the Trump administration. It's about something very difficult about philosophy.
Right.
So why don't you give us a little bit on that?
You know, there are various strands of the Republican Party, and unfortunately there are the Tucker Carlsons of the Republican Party, this neo-isolationist trend, which is very scary. I did not like the April 17th leak to the New York Times. Whoever did that, I think, was a traitor within the White House. These things have to be, as we say here in Israel, arba anayim, 4 eyes. None of this. This is supposed to be highly classified. I just want to say before I go on, there's one person I should be thanking, Alex Trayman and his wonderful wife, Sippy. But they are the best. I don't know if they're in the room, but I love them. But there's also another expression in Hebrew, and that's if you're not at the table, you are on the table. And we, the Israelis, have not been at the table during these talks. There is a story in today's Al Jazeera how the Israelis are disrupting the talks between the Iranians and the United States. Of course, we're always to be blamed because what we are doing is fighting our own war for our own very survival. And we have to be at the table, and we have to be informing the United States and listening to the United States. But of course, you know, there's no winning when it comes to being Jewish.
Eugene?
I think it's natural for Israelis to be, I think it's natural for Israelis to be concerned because so much is at stake, and Iran has made so completely clear their desire to exterminate everyone here. At the same time, not only does President Trump deserve the benefit of the doubt, I think he's going about things in a wise and deliberate manner. It's completely unrealistic to expect a president who also has a domestic agenda, who also has another foreign policy agenda outside of Israel, outside of the Middle East, to begin or tolerate a serious military confrontation in his first 100 days in office. He's being deliberate. He is checking the boxes. He is making sure he's gone through the process and can speak to all wings of his party and explain that he's had no choice. I think he has every reason to be trusted in this endeavor. At the same time, I think it's important, as we discuss these issues, too often Israel policy bears the weight of carrying on its back all good things for America and for the West. As I mentioned before, for example, you know, the ICC is not just bad for Israel, it's bad for the United States. And I think it's important to explain to American audiences that an Iranian or nuclear Iran is not just a problem for Israel. It is a problem for the United States. It is the end of an era for the United States. We were talking about attacking the Houthis. Forget about attacking the Houthis. America's going to be paying tribute to the Houthis, like they did to the Barbary pirates every time a ship passes through the, past the Gulf.
Which is why the U.S. Navy was founded.
Exactly, which is why the U.S. Navy was founded. It will be out of business, and that is why it is a core, essential U.S. interest. Israel is just the first to feel the effects, but it will be felt much beyond Israel.
Let me, as our time is supposedly running out, but we have one more question that we have to get to. We're talking about a transition from an administration that wasn't so friendly to one that is friendly. But we have to also talk about what happens in the future and the changes within the Democratic Party as perhaps AOC takes up the torch from Bernie Sanders and the old cult of the bipartisan consensus seems even more in the past. Can it survive? Can it be revived? And what does a Democratic Party that has drifted very far to the left, while the Republicans have become kind of the two parties have exchanged identities, what does that portend for the future? Each of you, just a minute.
Can I jump on this first?
Okay.
So it would be very nice if the Democrats jettison their AOC wing and come back to the center and become actually a pro-Israel party, as they have been for much of their history. We should not count on that. We should not make our plans based on that. And that is why we have a 4-year window in which we need to be looking for policies that lock in change. That's why it's important to get rid of, to sanction the ICC out of existence, to pass the Liable Act that will allow UNRWA to be bankrupted, that will allow other problematic UN agencies to be bankrupted, to quit problematic UN agencies like UNESCO and burn the ships behind you, right, like Cortez did. And we need to be looking for policies that lock in change, not just give us a four-year vacation.
Okay. I have to say, to be very honest, that I'm very worried. We might have a 2-year window to get a lot accomplished in Congress. I'm very afraid that the Democrats might take the House, might take the Senate. We have a lot of work to do. We have to roll up our sleeves, educate members and educate our own community, be thankful to our wonderful evangelical Christian friends that have really helped put Trump in the White House and have helped the Republican Party to grow. And I'm looking at you, Tommy Waller, who's amazing, and all of our wonderful Republicans out there, but we really have got to work hard.
If you don't mind, I just want to say something about the Republican Party, because I don't really have a difference. I'm pretty despondent about the Democratic Party. But on the Republican Party, I think, when we talk about the long term, look, Sarah mentioned Tucker Carlson. Obviously, we're concerned about this. I think a lot of the long term might depend on the short term. What I mean by that is, if Trump's policy, I mean, you could play this out in so many different ways. But let's just say, for the sake of argument, he cuts a bad deal with Iran. The Israelis act. There's a regional war. That could have an impact on how the Republicans think. If, on the other hand, he doesn't cut a bad deal, but he works with the Israelis, or at least supports an Israeli attack, and it's perceived as successful, that's also going to have an impact on how the Republican Party thinks. So I think I think how successful President Trump is going to have an impact about where the direction of the party goes. But what my hope is, obviously, is that the party sees that, and I'll add one other point, that my hope is that the party will see that working with our close allies is good for the United States. I'm sure Sarah finds this in Washington, or maybe you do as well. I remember I was thinking, I met this one Republican senator last year. I'd say I'm more on the isolationist wing of the party. He didn't like one foreigner, white, black, green, whatever color that country is made of, except Israel. And I just worry how long it is till people like that say, I'm not so sure I like the Israelis too much either. Now, obviously, Israel has a special place, I think, in the Republican heart, partly for all sorts of reasons, the commonality and strategic interests, the evangelicals, and so on. But my hope is that if President Trump could be someone internationalist, work with close allies like Israel, and that is perceived in the Republican Party as successful, I think that will be very good. But we'll have to see how this plays out, because it's going to affect the long term, is how President Trump does in the short term.
We'll still probably be talking about this at next year's, God willing,
good.
summit. Thank you to our panel for a great discussion. Thanks to all of you for being here and being part of this great event.
Thank you very much to our panel.